The metalworking workshop hummed with the sound of plasma torches and molecular forges, filling the air with ozone and heated metal. Captain Rebecca "Brick" Morrison stood at the entrance, her weathered combat boots silent against the polished floor as she surveyed the scene before her. 37 alien cadets from 12 different species worked at their stations, their movements precise and ritualistic as they crafted their ceremonial blades for the upcoming trial of first blood. The Zephyrian twins, tall and ethereal with their translucent blue skin, manipulated crystalline matrices that would form the core of their energy weapons. Their 4 arms moved in perfect synchronization, weaving light itself into deadly beauty. Nearby, a massive Korvaki warrior caste hammered molten steel with appendages that could crush a human skull like an eggshell, sparks cascading off his chitinous exoskeleton in golden showers. The delicate Shirai engineer floated above her workstation, her tentacles dancing through the air as she assembled micro-components for a blade that would be sharper than a molecular edge. Each species brought millennia of martial tradition to their craft. The humans brought nothing. Morrison had watched 17 classes graduate from the Galactic Military Academy, had seen the respect and fear these cadets commanded from their instructors. Today marked her first time overseeing the trial preparation, and the familiar weight of being underestimated settled on her shoulders like an old coat. She'd felt it during her first diplomatic assignment, when the Altarian Council had seated her at the children's table. She'd felt it during the Centauri border conflict, when Allied commanders assumed she was a clerk. She'd felt it every day for the past 23 years of military service. The Nexari instructor, his scaled hide gleaming silver under the workshop lights, approached with the fluid grace of a predator. His species had conquered 17 star systems before humanity had even achieved spaceflight, and every gesture reminded observers of that fact. Captain Morrison, his voice carried the authority of ancient victory, your human cadet appears to be confused about the assignment. Morrison followed his gaze to the far corner of the workshop, where Cadet Jamie Rodriguez sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by what looked like refuse. Empty nutrient pouches, discarded metal shavings, broken optical components, and a shattered bottle of Terran whiskey formed a seemingly random collection around her. While every other cadet worked with materials worth small fortunes, Rodriguez appeared to be playing in garbage. The trial requires a blade, Captain, the instructor continued, his inner eyelids flickering with what Morrison recognized as barely contained contempt. Not whatever primitive ritual your species practices with refuse. The word primitive carried special emphasis, the way it always did when galactic citizens discussed humanity. They'd been saying it for 50 years, ever since first contact. Primitive technology, primitive culture, primitive minds. Morrison said nothing, merely nodded toward Rodriguez and walked closer. She'd learned long ago that the most effective response to condescension was patience. Let them talk, let them assume, let them dig their own graves with expectations. The cadet looked up as Morrison approached, her dark eyes bright with the kind of focus that came from years of combat engineering. Rodriguez had grown up in the Detroit industrial zone, where scrap metal and ingenuity were the only resources that mattered. She'd earned her place at the academy, not through family connections or species privilege, but by rebuilding a crashed shuttle with nothing but salvage and stubborn determination. Morrison had read her file. The girl had been fixing broken things since she could hold tools. Cadet Rodriguez, Morrison's voice carried just loud enough for the nearby aliens to hear. Status report. Rodriguez scrambled to her feet, her movements economical and sure. Working on the assignment, Captain. Trial blade construction is proceeding on schedule. She gestured to the collection of seemingly worthless materials at her feet. Resource acquisition phase complete. Around them, other cadets had begun to notice the exchange. The Korvaki warrior paused in his hammering, his compound eyes rotating to observe. The Zephyrian twins slowed their graceful weaving, light patterns flickering with curiosity. Even the usually oblivious Voltan scholar looked up from his gravitational flux manipulator. The Nexari instructor's scales rippled with what Morrison knew was amusement. In their culture, mockery was an art form, and humans provided endless entertainment. "Captain, surely you can see the problem. The trial of first blood is sacred to our military tradition. Each cadet must forge a weapon worthy of their heritage, something that speaks to their species' warrior spirit. What heritage does your cadet intend to honor with trash?" Morrison looked down at Rodriguez, seeing the slight tightening around her eyes that meant the girl was fighting not to respond. Good. Let the instructor dig deeper. Let him commit fully to his assumptions. "The Altarians forge blades from stellar plasma," the instructor continued, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer addressing particularly slow students. "The Korvaki use metals from the core of dead worlds. The Zephyrians weave light itself into cutting edges that can slice through reality. These are weapons with history, with power, with meaning." He gestured dismissively at Rodriguez's collection. "What can your species possibly contribute to such company?" The workshop had grown quieter, other conversations dying as cadets tuned into the discussion. Morrison felt the familiar tingle that preceded moments like this, the electric anticipation that came when the universe was about to shift slightly on its axis. She'd felt it on Kepler 442b, when the hegemony fleet arrived to find humans had somehow survived 3 months of siege. She'd felt it during the Tau Ceti negotiations when humanity's primitive proposal ended up saving both species from war. She'd felt it every time someone made the mistake of assuming human limits. "Rodriguez," Morrison said calmly, "show him your heritage." The cadet's grin was sharp as any blade forged in this workshop. She knelt back down and picked up the broken whiskey bottle, its jagged edges catching the light like crystal fangs. The bottle had been expensive once, a gift from her grandfather before he shipped out for the Proxima campaign. It had traveled with her from Detroit to Luna Station to the Academy, a reminder of home and sacrifice. Now it was about to become something else entirely. Rodriguez lifted a heavy maintenance wrench from her collection of salvage, the tool scarred from years of honest work. Around the workshop, sophisticated aliens paused their delicate crafting to watch the human do something incomprehensible. The Nexari instructor's scales shifted to a pattern Morrison recognized as anticipation of entertainment. "My people," Rodriguez said quietly, her voice carrying in the sudden hush, "have been making weapons out of whatever we could find for a very long time." She brought the wrench down on the bottle's neck, the impact sharp and precise. Glass fragments scattered, but she'd positioned the strike perfectly. The bottle's bottom section remained intact, but now it bore a crown of vicious edges. She set it aside and reached for a length of industrial cable, the kind used to secure cargo in zero-G transports. The watching cadets exchanged glances that Morrison could read like written language, confusion from the scholarly species, contempt from the warrior cultures, curiosity from the engineers. They were all waiting for the human to embarrass herself, to prove once again that humanity's place in galactic society was somewhere near the bottom of the hierarchy. Rodriguez began wrapping the cable around the bottle's intact base, her movements sure and practiced. The cable provided grip and weight, transforming the broken glass from accident into intention. She'd learned this technique from her uncle, who'd learned it from gang fights in the Chicago ruins. Urban combat, they'd called it, making weapons from whatever the city provided. "Cadet," the Nexari instructor's voice dripped with condescension, "the trial requires actual forging, heat, pressure, molecular restructuring. What you're doing is craft time." Morrison watched Rodriguez's shoulders tighten, saw the girl's jaw set in a way that meant trouble for someone. The captain had worn that same expression during her first briefing with Galactic Command, when they'd explained that humans would serve primarily in support roles due to their species' obvious limitations. "Instructor," Rodriguez replied without looking up from her work. My species has been in exactly one galactic war. We've also won exactly one galactic war. She tested the grip, adjusting the cable wrapping with the precision of someone who understood that lives depended on details. Maybe our methods work. The Korvaki warrior made a sound like grinding stone, which Morrison knew was laughter. His species appreciated boldness, even from inferior beings. The Altarian cadets whispered among themselves in their crystal voice language, probably debating whether the human was brave or simply too stupid to understand her place. Rodriguez wasn't finished with the bottle. She reached into her collection and pulled out a handful of metal shavings, the refuse from more sophisticated weapons being forged around her. Working with quick, sure movements, she began pressing the shavings into the cable wrapping, embedding them like scales on a serpent's back. Each shard would create new cutting surfaces, would turn every impact into multiple wounds. The Nexari instructor's scales had shifted to a pattern Morrison didn't recognize, something between confusion and the beginning of concern. "This is not how weapons are made," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Maybe not your weapons," Rodriguez replied, still working. She'd found a small plasma torch, the kind used for precision welding, and began carefully fusing the embedded metal shavings to the cable. The smell of heated metal mixed with melting synthetic fiber filled the air around her station. But humans don't get to choose our battles. We fight with what we have, when we have to fight. She was transforming the improvised weapon again, the metal shavings forming a textured grip that would prevent slipping even when covered in blood. Morrison had seen similar modifications on weapons recovered from the Proxima campaign, where human Marines had been forced to fight hegemony shock troops with whatever they could scavenge from destroyed supply depots. The workshop around them had grown completely silent now. Even the Voltan scholar had abandoned his gravitational manipulations to watch the human work. There was something hypnotic about Rodriguez's movements, the way she found purpose in material that others would discard. She was building something that had no precedent in any military manual, something that existed outside the carefully catalogued traditions of galactic warfare. Rodriguez lifted a shard of broken optical glass from her pile, holding it up to catch the light. The fragment was no larger than a human fingernail, but it gleamed with perfect clarity. Carefully, precisely, she began pressing it into the bottle's jagged crown, adding another cutting edge to an already dangerous array. The Altarians forged their blades in the heart of stars, the Nexari instructor said, his voice now uncertain. The Korvaki use metals that took millennia to form in stellar cores. The Zephyrians manipulate the very fabric of space-time. These are weapons worthy of galactic warriors. Morrison saw Rodriguez's grin grow sharper, saw the girl's dark eyes light up with something that made the captain's own pulse quicken. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself during the Battle of Titan, when hegemony command ships had surrounded the human fleet and demanded surrender. "Instructor," Rodriguez said quietly, "ask me where humans forge their weapons." The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a blade held at the perfect angle to catch light and throw it back as a weapon of its own. Around the workshop, sophisticated aliens waited for an answer that would either confirm their superiority or force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the primitive species in their midst. Morrison felt the familiar electricity building, the sense that the universe was about to learn something new about human nature. She'd been waiting 23 years for this moment, waiting for humanity to show the galaxy exactly what they were capable of when pushed into a corner with nothing but scraps and determination. The Nexari instructor's scales rippled with patterns Morrison had never seen before, confusion mixing with something that might have been the beginning of respect. "Very well, cadet. Where do humans forge their weapons?" Rodriguez stood, her improvised blade gleaming in her grip like something pulled from a nightmare or a revolution. The bottle's broken edges caught the workshop lights and threw them back in sharp fragments, each reflection a promise of violence. The embedded metal shavings glinted along the wrapped handle, and the optical glass fragment blazed like a captured star. "Wherever we have to," she said, and her voice carried the weight of Detroit foundries and Luna Station workshops, of battlefield repairs and desperate innovations. "We forge them in the ruins of our cities, in the cargo holds of damaged ships, in the trenches while the enemy advances." She lifted the weapon, testing its balance with movements that spoke of muscle memory older than space travel. "We forge them out of whatever will cut, whatever will break, whatever will make the other bastards stop fighting long enough for us to win." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of air recyclers and the barely audible sound of 37 aliens breathing in patterns that suggested rapid recalculation of previously held assumptions. Morrison had seen this moment before, in different forms and different contexts. The moment when the galaxy realized that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't superior technology or ancient wisdom or evolutionary advantages. It was the absolute refusal to accept that any fight was unwinnable, that any resource was too humble to become a weapon, that any enemy was too powerful to defeat. The Nexari instructor's scales had settled into a pattern Morrison finally recognized, wariness mixed with dawning respect. It was the same expression she'd seen on Altarian faces after the humans had somehow survived the siege of Kepler 442b. The same look hegemony commanders wore after learning that human suicide runs weren't actually suicide, just a different definition of acceptable losses. Rodriguez wasn't done. She reached into her collection one final time and pulled out something that made several cadets step backward, a small canister of industrial solvent, the kind used to clean molecular forge chambers. Morrison recognized it immediately and felt her own pulse quicken. The girl wasn't just making a weapon, she was making a statement. "The thing about human weapons," Rodriguez continued, her voice conversational as she carefully applied solvent to the bottle's edges, "is that we don't just forge them to cut, we forge them to teach." The solvent ate into the glass, creating microscopic serrations that would never heal properly, that would leave wounds too complex for standard medical treatment. "Every time someone fights one of us and survives, they learn something important about humans." She held up the completed weapon, and Morrison saw several alien cadets actually take another step back. The improvised blade was hideous and beautiful, primitive and terrifyingly effective. It looked like something pulled from humanity's violent past, but it incorporated materials and techniques that were purely products of the galactic age. It was everything the aliens expected from humans and everything they feared about humanity, all wrapped in one scarred and deadly package. "They learn," Rodriguez said, her grin now sharp enough to cut steel, "that humans don't fight fair." The words hit the workshop like a physical blow, and Morrison watched as the implications rippled through 37 alien minds in real time. Fair fighting was a concept deeply embedded in galactic military culture. Honor duels, ritualized combat, rules of engagement that dated back millennia. Even in war, there were protocols, expectations, limitations that civilized species observed. Humans had never been civilized by galactic standards. The Korvaki warrior's grinding laugh filled the sudden silence, his appreciation for effective brutality overriding his species' usual contempt for weaker beings. The Altarians had gone completely still, their crystal voices silent as they processed what they'd just witnessed. The Zephyrian twins had stopped their light weaving entirely, their four arms hanging motionless as they stared at the human's creation. Morrison saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in the Nexari instructor's reptilian features. His scales shifted through patterns too fast to follow, and his voice when he spoke carried a tone she'd never heard from his species before. "You're not making a ceremonial blade," he said slowly. "You're making a war weapon." Rodriguez's grin could have powered a small spacecraft. "Instructor, humans don't really do ceremonial." The trial of first blood had been a tradition for over 3,000 years, dating back to the original Galactic Compact when the founding species agreed to test their military cadets in ritual combat. It was meant to be educational, ceremonial, a way for young warriors to demonstrate their heritage and prove their readiness for service. The combat was formal, conducted according to strict protocols that ensured honor while minimizing actual bloodshed. Captain Morrison stood on the observation deck overlooking the arena, watching as alien cadets took their positions for the traditional opening ceremony. Each species had their rituals, their formal presentations of weapons and heritage that dated back millennia. The Altarians sang crystalline hymns that made the arena's walls vibrate in harmony. The Korvaki performed complex martial forms that showcased their devastating physical power. The Zephyrians wove patterns of light that told stories of ancient victories. Human Cadet Rodriguez stood alone at position 38, her improvised weapon held casually at her side. She wore the same ceremonial armor as every other cadet, but somehow managed to make it look like practical equipment rather than formal wear. Where others carried blades that gleamed with perfection, hers looked like something pulled from a battlefield. The Nexari instructor approached Morrison with the fluid stride that marked his species as apex predators. His scales had settled into patterns that suggested barely controlled concern. "Captain, there has been some discussion among the faculty regarding your cadet's weapon." Morrison kept her eyes on the arena floor, where Rodriguez was performing what might generously be called warm-up exercises. The human moved like someone who'd learned to fight in places where losing meant dying, every motion economical and purposeful. "What kind of discussion, instructor?" "Several faculty members have expressed concern that the weapon is inappropriate for ceremonial combat." The Nexari's inner eyelids flickered in patterns Morrison recognized as diplomatic distress. "The trial is meant to be educational, a demonstration of species heritage and military tradition. Your cadet's weapon appears designed for actual warfare." That drew Morrison's attention from the arena. She turned to face the instructor, noting how his posture had shifted subtly since yesterday. Less casual dominance, more wary respect. "Are you saying human military heritage isn't appropriate for a military academy?" The instructor's scales rippled through patterns that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. "Captain, your species' approach to combat is unconventional by galactic standards. The other faculty are concerned that allowing weapons designed for maximum lethality might compromise the educational nature of the exercise." Morrison felt the familiar tingle that preceded moments when the universe shifted. She'd felt it yesterday in the workshop, and now it was building again. "Instructor, in your professional opinion, what is the primary purpose of military training?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His scales settled into academic patterns as he shifted into lecturer mode. "Military training serves to prepare warriors for service to the Compact. It builds discipline, demonstrates species capabilities, and maintains the traditions that have kept galactic civilization stable for millennia." "And in humanity's professional opinion," Morrison replied quietly, "military training serves to keep soldiers alive long enough to complete their missions." She turned back to the arena, where the opening ceremonies were reaching their climax. "Maybe that's why our approaches seem different." Below them, the Altarian cadets finished their crystal song and took their positions. Their weapons gleamed like captured starlight, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The Korvaki warriors hefted massive blades that could cleave through battleship armor, each one a masterwork of metallurgy and martial heritage. The Zephyrian constructs pulsed with contained energy, ready to slice through the fabric of space itself. And in position 38, Rodriguez tossed her improvised weapon from hand to hand like it was a tool rather than a work of art. The instructor's voice carried new undertones that Morrison couldn't quite identify. "Captain, The faculty has discussed implementing special protocols for your cadets' participation, modified rules that would account for the unusual nature of her weapon. Morrison's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. You want to change the rules? For one human with a broken bottle? The weapon creates variables that our traditional protocols don't account for, the instructor admitted. The solvent treatment means any wound will be complicated to heal. The embedded metal fragments increase tissue damage exponentially. The improvised nature makes it difficult to predict combat patterns or defensive strategies. So you're saying it's effective? The instructor's scales shifted to patterns Morrison had never seen before, something between admission and warning. Captain, effectiveness in the trial is not measured by lethality. It's measured by demonstration of species heritage, adherence to honorable combat principles, and educational value for observers. Morrison watched as the ceremony master called for final preparations. Cadets across the arena began activating their weapons, filling the air with the hum of energy fields and the gleam of perfected metal. Rodriguez simply lifted her bottle, checking the grip wrapping with the casual attention of someone who'd done this before. "Tell me, instructor," Morrison said quietly, "what do you think human heritage looks like?" Before he could answer, the ceremony master's voice boomed across the arena, beginning the formal challenges. This was the moment when each cadet would face 3 opponents in ritual combat, demonstrating their species' martial traditions while testing their readiness for military service. The matches were carefully choreographed to showcase technique and heritage while avoiding serious injury. The Altarian cadets went first, their crystalline weapons singing as they danced through formal combat patterns that had been refined over centuries. Beautiful, precise, deadly, within carefully defined parameters. The crowd of observers made appreciative sounds as light played off their blades, creating patterns that told stories of ancient victories and noble defeats. The Korvaki matches followed, raw power channeled through millennia of martial discipline. Their weapons were extensions of their bodies, massive and brutal, but controlled with perfect precision. Each strike could have shattered stone, but landed exactly where intended, demonstrating dominance without crossing the line into actual violence. The Zephyrians wove light itself into combat, their energy constructs shifting through configurations that defied easy understanding. Their matches were less combat than choreographed physics lessons, demonstrations of their species' mastery over forces that others could barely comprehend. Each performance was exactly what the observers expected: ancient traditions, refined techniques, species heritage displayed with perfect adherence to established protocols. The trial was proceeding exactly as it had for 3,000 years, until they called Rodriguez's number. The human cadet walked to the center of the arena with the easy stride of someone heading to work rather than ritual combat. Her first opponent was a voltaic scholar warrior, his gravitational flux blade capable of cutting through molecular bonds by altering local space-time. The weapon was a masterwork of theoretical physics made manifest, beautiful in its elegant complexity. Rodriguez stood across from him with a broken bottle wrapped in cable and embedded with scrap metal. The mismatch was so obvious that several observers laughed, the sound echoing through the arena like crystal chimes. The voltaic cadet bowed formally, his species' traditional gesture of respect for an honorable opponent. Rodriguez nodded back, then shifted into a stance that Morrison recognized from Detroit street fighting. The ceremony master called for combat to begin. The voltaic cadet moved with scholarly precision, his gravitational blade tracing complex patterns through the air as he demonstrated his species' mathematical approach to warfare. Each cut was calculated to demonstrate technique while minimizing harm, a textbook example of how civilized beings conducted ritual combat. Rodriguez waited until he committed to a formal overhead strike, then stepped inside his guard and drove her bottle up toward his center mass. The impact was brutal and brief. The voltaic's sophisticated armor absorbed most of the damage, but the embedded metal shavings caught and held, turning what should have been a glancing blow into a grappling opportunity. Rodriguez twisted, using her opponent's own momentum against him, and suddenly, the scholarly warrior was on the ground with a broken bottle pressed against his throat. The arena went completely silent. In formal combat, such a position would trigger an immediate cessation, with both combatants returning to neutral positions to continue the demonstration. Rodriguez's weapon should have been withdrawn, the match reset according to ancient protocols that governed civilized warfare. Instead, Rodriguez leaned closer to her opponent and said something that only he could hear. Morrison couldn't make out the words, but she saw the voltaic cadet's eyes widen in what looked like genuine terror. When Rodriguez finally stepped back and offered her opponent a hand up, he took it with movements that suggested he was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about humans. The ceremony master called the first match complete, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious deviation from established protocols. Rodriguez walked back to her starting position, bottle still dripping solvent that left small scorch marks on the arena floor. Her second opponent was an Altarian battle dancer, her crystalline blade designed to channel stellar energies into cutting edges that could slice through reality itself. She approached the match with the confidence of someone whose species had perfected warfare before humans discovered fire. Rodriguez met her in the center with the casual attitude of someone who'd never heard of stellar energies or crystalline matrices or any of the sophisticated concepts that separated civilized warfare from primitive brutality. The Altarian opened with a traditional greeting strike, her blade leaving trails of light as it traced through formal patterns that served as both attack and artistic expression. It was beautiful, precise, and utterly predictable to anyone who'd studied galactic martial traditions. Rodriguez hadn't studied galactic martial traditions. She'd learned to fight from humans who'd survived the gang wars of Earth's industrial zones, people who'd never heard of honor or formal patterns or civilized approaches to violence. She threw her bottle. The improvised weapon tumbled end over end through the air, completely violating every protocol for civilized combat. The Altarian's blade moved to intercept it, stellar energies flaring as sophisticated technology met primitive brutality. The bottle shattered against the crystalline edge, but Rodriguez was already moving. While the Altarian dealt with glass fragments and solvent spray, the human had closed distance and was fighting with her hands, her teeth, her elbows, anything that could cause damage. It was ugly, brutal, and absolutely effective. Within seconds, the battle dancer was on the ground, her sophisticated weapon several meters away, trying to protect vital organs from a human who fought like civilization had never been invented. Morrison heard sounds from the observation deck that suggested several species were experiencing new emotions. The Korvaki were making their grinding laugh sound, appreciation for effective violence overriding their usual contempt for weaker beings. The Zephyrians had gone completely still, their light forms flickering in patterns that suggested rapid information processing. The Nexari instructor's scales had shifted to patterns Morrison recognized as the beginning of panic. Rodriguez helped her second opponent to her feet as well, the gesture almost gentle after the savagery of the actual combat. The Altarian accepted the assistance with movements that suggested she was rapidly recalculating her species' assumptions about human capabilities. The ceremony master called for the final match, his voice carrying undertones that suggested he was also reconsidering established protocols. Rodriguez's last opponent was supposed to be another human cadet, creating what should have been an evenly matched demonstration of species heritage. Instead, they called forward Cadet Thane Corvanis, eldest son of the Korvaki warrior caste. Morrison felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the political implications. The Korvaki were the Compact's premier warrior species, their military traditions dating back millennia before human spaceflight. Putting their finest cadet against the human wasn't just a match, it was a statement about relative species capabilities. Thane stood nearly 3 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming like polished stone. His weapon was a masterwork of Korvaki metallurgy, forged from metals that existed only in the cores of dead stars and tempered in the heart of a gas giant. It could cleave through battleship armor and had been blessed by warrior priests whose martial traditions were older than human civilization. Rodriguez looked up at him and grinned. The grin was sharp enough to cut, carrying the kind of dangerous humor that Morrison had seen on human faces right before they did something that redefined the tactical situation. She'd worn that same grin during the Battle of Titan, when hegemony commanders had demanded humanity's surrender and received a very different kind of answer. The ceremony master called for combat to begin, his voice now carrying a tone that suggested he was beginning to understand that this trial might become something very different from the traditional educational exercise he'd expected. Thane moved with the devastating grace of a species bred for warfare, his massive blade tracing through patterns that demonstrated perfect control of overwhelming power. Each movement was a lesson in martial heritage, a display of the disciplined violence that had made the Korvaki the Compact's most feared warriors. Rodriguez waited until he was fully committed to a formal demonstration strike, then threw a handful of glass fragments directly into his compound eyes. The sound that erupted from the Korvaki cadet was unlike anything Morrison had heard in 23 years of military service. It wasn't quite pain, wasn't quite rage, but something deeper and more primal. Thane's species had evolved as apex predators on a world where everything was designed to kill everything else, and the sound he made was what happened when something that had never been prey suddenly found itself fighting for survival. Rodriguez didn't give him time to recover. While Thane clawed at his eyes with his secondary arms, she was already inside his guard, the remains of her bottle pressed against the joint where his exoskeleton offered minimal protection. The solvent she'd applied earlier was eating through his natural armor, creating wounds that would heal slowly and scar permanently. From the observation deck, Morrison could hear the Nexari instructor making sounds that his species only produced under extreme stress. Several other faculty members were speaking rapidly in languages she didn't recognize, but their tones suggested they were debating whether to stop the match entirely. They were too late for that consideration. Thane managed to clear his vision enough to bring his weapon around in a devastating arc that should have removed Rodriguez's head from her shoulders. The human dropped below the strike, rolled between his legs, and came up behind him with movements that spoke of experience fighting opponents who were bigger, stronger, and better armed. She'd wrapped the broken cable from her weapon around one of his ankles. The Korvaki warrior went down like a falling mountain, his massive frame hitting the arena floor with an impact that Morrison felt through the deck plates. Rodriguez was on him immediately, using her smaller size and superior agility to stay in positions where his strength couldn't be effectively applied. She fought like someone who'd learned that survival meant using every advantage available, no matter how small or temporary. The arena had gone silent except for the sounds of combat and the increasingly frantic discussions among faculty members. This had stopped being a ceremonial demonstration and become something else entirely, something that existed outside the careful protocols that governed civilized interaction between species. Thane managed to throw Rodriguez off through sheer strength, his secondary arms finally finding purchase against her smaller frame. She rolled with the impact, came up with another handful of glass fragments, and threw them with the accuracy of someone who'd learned to fight dirty before she learned to walk. This time she aimed for the joints in his armor, the places where even Korvaki engineering couldn't provide complete protection. Solvent-treated glass embedded itself in gaps around his shoulders, his hip joints, the flexible sections that allowed movement. Each fragment was a small wound, but collectively they were changing the nature of the combat from demonstration to survival. Morrison had seen this pattern before in reports from the Proxima campaign, where human Marines had fought hegemony shock troops. The aliens had superior technology, better armor, more sophisticated weapons. The humans had won anyway, through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept that technological superiority meant tactical victory. Thane was learning what hegemony commanders had learned 50 years earlier. Fighting humans wasn't about matching their capabilities. It was about surviving their complete lack of interest in fair competition. The Korvaki warrior tried to create distance, using his longer reach and superior strength to establish the kind of formal combat range where his species' advantages would dominate. Rodriguez stayed close, moving in patterns that suggested she'd learned urban combat in places where fighting fair meant dying quickly. She was inside his guard again, her remaining weapons pressed against points where his armor was compromised. But instead of pressing the attack, she did something that made Morrison's pulse quicken with recognition. She started talking. Morrison couldn't hear the words from the observation deck, but she could see their effect on Thane's posture. The Korvaki warrior's aggressive stance shifted subtly, his compound eyes focusing on the human's face with an intensity that suggested he was hearing something unexpected. The conversation lasted perhaps 30 seconds, probably less. When it ended, Thane straightened to his full height and executed a formal bow that Morrison recognized from diplomatic functions. It was the gesture his species reserved for worthy opponents, acknowledgement of martial skill that transcended species boundaries. Rodriguez returned the bow with movements that suggested she understood its significance, then helped the massive alien to his feet. When Thane walked back to his position, his gait carried the careful precision of someone who'd discovered that his assumptions about the universe required significant revision. The ceremony master called the trial complete, his voice carefully neutral, despite the obvious deviation from 3,000 years of established tradition. Around the arena, alien cadets stood in patterns that suggested rapid recalculation of previously held beliefs. Morrison watched as Rodriguez collected the fragments of her improvised weapon, noting how other cadets gave her a wider berth than they'd provided before the matches began. The human walked back to her position with the same casual stride she'd used at the beginning, but something fundamental had changed in the way others perceived her. The Nexari instructor appeared at Morrison's elbow, his scales cycling through patterns that suggested profound conceptual distress. "Captain, we need to discuss what just happened." Morrison kept her eyes on Rodriguez, who was now surrounded by a small group of alien cadets asking questions in rapid, excited voices. The human was answering with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious concepts to children, but Morrison could see the sharp humor in her expression. "What happened, instructor, is that humanity demonstrated its military heritage." "That wasn't heritage," the instructor replied, his voice carrying overtones Morrison had never heard from his species. "That was something else entirely." Morrison finally turned to face him, noting how his posture had shifted since the morning. Less confident authority, more wary respect. "What do you think human military heritage looks like, instructor? What do you think we learned during 50,000 years of killing each other over resources?" The instructor's scales had settled into patterns that suggested he was beginning to understand implications he'd never considered. The other species developed martial traditions, formal combat protocols, rules that governed how civilized beings conducted warfare. Humanity developed methods for killing anything that threatened our survival, Morrison interrupted quietly. We never had the luxury of civilized warfare. Every fight was for resources we needed, territory we required, the right to exist in a universe that was trying to kill us. She gestured toward the arena, where Rodriguez was demonstrating grip techniques to a fascinated Zephyrian cadet. "You wanted to see our heritage, instructor. You wanted to understand what humans contribute to galactic military culture." The instructor followed her gaze, his scales shifting through patterns that Morrison was beginning to recognize as the beginning of genuine fear. "Captain," he said slowly, "what did your cadets say to Warrior Thane during their final exchange?" Morrison's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. She'd wondered when someone would ask that question, wondered when the implications would finally penetrate the careful assumptions that governed galactic civilization. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" But even as she said it, Morrison knew the instructor wouldn't need to ask. The answer was written in Thane's posture as he stood among his fellow Korvaki cadets, written in the way he kept glancing toward Rodriguez with expressions that mixed respect and wariness in equal measure. The human cadet had told him the same thing she'd told her other opponents, the same thing human soldiers had been telling their enemies for 50,000 years of continuous warfare. She'd explained exactly how easy it would be to kill him, not in some theoretical future combat, not with better weapons or superior technology. Right there, right then, with nothing but broken glass and the absolute certainty that humans didn't fight to demonstrate heritage or honor traditions or provide educational experiences for observers. Humans fought to win. The realization was spreading through the gathered cadets like ripples through water. Morrison could see it in their movements, the subtle shifts in posture and formation that indicated rapid reassessment of threat levels. The Altarians had moved closer together, their crystalline voices producing harmonics that suggested consultation with ancestral databases. The Zephyrians' light forms flickered in patterns that indicated high-speed information processing. Even the Voltaic scholar warriors had abandoned their usual contemplative dispersal, clustering in configurations that Morrison recognized as defensive formations disguised as academic discussion. The trial of first blood has been conducted for over 3 millennia, the instructor said, his voice carrying new undertones that suggested his species' careful confidence was undergoing rapid revision. It serves to demonstrate species heritage while maintaining the protocols that keep galactic civilization stable. Morrison watched as Rodriguez finished her impromptu weapons demonstration and began walking toward the exit. Other cadets parted to let her pass, but Morrison noted that several followed at what they probably thought was discreet distance. The human's casual stride hadn't changed, but something in her posture suggested she was aware of the attention and found it amusing. "Instructor," Morrison said quietly, "what makes you think human heritage is compatible with stability?" The question hung in the air like a blade held at the perfect angle to catch light and throw it back as a weapon. Around them, the observation deck had grown quieter as other faculty members tuned into their conversation, alien minds processing implications that had never occurred to them during 50 years of human integration into galactic society. The Nexari instructor's scales cycled through patterns Morrison had never seen before, something between intellectual curiosity and the beginning of existential dread. "Captain, are you suggesting that humanity's approach to warfare is fundamentally incompatible with established galactic military doctrine?" Morrison's laugh was sharp enough to shatter crystal. "Instructor, I'm suggesting that humanity's approach to warfare is fundamentally incompatible with the assumption that anyone else's military doctrine matters when survival is at stake." She turned to face the gathered faculty, noting how representatives from dozen species had unconsciously arranged themselves in patterns that suggested they were beginning to understand that this conversation was about more than one cadet's unusual weapon choice. "You've spent 50 years trying to figure out where humans fit in your galactic hierarchy," Morrison continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the observation deck. "You've debated our technological limitations, our cultural primitiveness, our obvious inferiority in every measurable category that matters to civilized species." The Altarian faculty representative made crystalline sounds that Morrison recognized as diplomatic distress. Several Korvaki instructors had shifted into positions that suggested they were reconsidering their species' assumptions about human military capabilities. "But you never asked the right question," Morrison said, her smile growing sharper. "You never asked what happens when a species that spent 50,000 years learning to kill anything that threatens its survival decides that something represents an existential threat." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of cadets leaving the arena and the barely audible hum of life support systems cycling through their routine functions. Morrison could feel the weight of alien attention, dozens of sophisticated minds processing information that forced them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of galactic civilization. The Nexari instructor's voice, when he finally spoke, carried tones Morrison had never heard from his species. "Captain, are you threatening the compact?" Morrison's laugh echoed through the observation deck like a weapon discharge. "Instructor, I'm explaining why the compact has never needed to worry about threats from humanity." She gestured toward the arena floor, where maintenance crews were already cleaning up the debris from Rodriguez's improvised weapon. "Every species in this room has spent millennia developing martial traditions, honor codes, rules of engagement that define how civilized beings conduct warfare. You fight according to protocols that preserve cultural heritage and maintain social stability." Her voice dropped to a tone that carried the weight of 23 years military service, of battles fought in places where protocol meant less than survival, and cultural heritage was a luxury that dead civilizations couldn't afford. Humans fight to eliminate threats, permanently, completely, with whatever methods prove most effective. She met the instructor's reptilian gaze directly, noting how his inner eyelids flickered in patterns that suggested rapid recalculation of threat assessments. "We don't fight wars to demonstrate our heritage, instructor. We fight wars to ensure that our heritage survives to be demonstrated." The implications rippled through the gathered faculty like shockwaves through a stellar medium. Morrison could see understanding dawning in alien features, the moment when sophisticated minds began processing the real reason humanity had integrated so smoothly into galactic civilization despite their obvious technological inferiority. It wasn't because humans were weak or primitive or naturally subservient. It was because the compact had never given humanity a reason to consider galactic civilization an existential threat. The Korvaki war instructor made grinding sounds that Morrison recognized as his species' expression of profound respect mixed with the beginning of genuine fear. His people had built their culture around the concept of honorable warfare, martial excellence constrained by ancient traditions that preserved the dignity of both victor and vanquished. The human approach to warfare didn't recognize the concept of dignity in defeat. It recognized only survival or extinction, victory or elimination, continuation or complete termination of whatever represented a threat to human existence. "The Proxima campaign," the war instructor said slowly, his voice carrying new understanding. "When the hegemony invaded human space, they expected resistance according to established galactic protocols." Morrison nodded, remembering reports that had redefined how alien military theorists understood human capabilities. The hegemony expected humans to surrender when faced with overwhelming technological superiority. Instead, they discovered that humans define overwhelming differently than most species. The campaign had lasted 18 months, officially. Unofficially, hegemony fleets were still finding human survivors in asteroid belts and gas giant atmospheres, tiny groups of refugees who had somehow managed to turn mining equipment into weapon systems and cargo haulers into attack craft. Human military doctrine didn't recognize the concept of hopeless odds. It recognized only the requirement to continue fighting until either the threat was eliminated or humanity was extinct. "Captain," the Altarian representative's crystal voice carried harmonics that suggested consultation with databases spanning galactic history. "Are you implying that human military integration into compact forces represents a strategic advantage?" Morrison's smile could have powered a small spacecraft. "I'm implying that every species in the compact sleeps more soundly, knowing that humans consider galactic civilization worth defending." The statement hung in the air like a promise and a warning, elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Around the observation deck, alien faculty members exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand why human integration into galactic military structures had proceeded so smoothly despite initial resistance from several member species. It wasn't because humans brought superior technology or ancient wisdom or evolutionary advantages to the compact's military capabilities. It was because humans brought the absolute certainty that any threat to galactic civilization would face opponents who had spent 50,000 years learning to transform anything into a weapon and who had never developed the concept of acceptable defeat. The Nexari instructor's scales had settled into patterns Morrison finally recognized, the complex interweaving of respect, wariness, and gratitude that marked how apex predators acknowledged the presence of something even more dangerous that happened to be on their side. "Captain," he said quietly, "I believe I'm beginning to understand why the Academy's integration protocols have been so successful." Morrison watched through the observation windows as cadets from a dozen species made their way back to dormitory sectors, noting how the groups now included humans in configurations that hadn't existed before the trial. Rodriguez walked among a cluster of Altarian battle dancers, her hands moving as she explained techniques that had no names in galactic languages. "The Academy doesn't teach humans to fight like galactic citizens," Morrison replied. "It teaches galactic citizens to fight alongside humans." The distinction was crucial, and she could see understanding spreading through alien minds as they processed the implications. Human integration into compact military structures hadn't been about bringing humanity up to galactic standards. It had been about incorporating human capabilities into forces that had previously operated according to civilized protocols. The result was military units that could engage in traditional galactic warfare when circumstances required diplomatic solutions, and could shift to human-style total warfare when circumstances required the complete elimination of threats. The other species contribute technological superiority, ancient wisdom, evolutionary specializations, Morrison continued, watching as her words sank into alien consciousness like stones dropping into deep water. Humanity contributes the absolute certainty that we will use whatever methods prove necessary to ensure that our allies survive. She turned from the observation window to face the gathered faculty directly, noting how representatives from dozen species had unconsciously arranged themselves in patterns that suggested both respect and wariness. "Every human in compact service carries the knowledge that we are the galaxy's insurance policy against existential threats," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 50 years of careful integration and mutual understanding. "We're the species you call when the established protocols have failed and survival requires methods that civilized beings prefer not to contemplate." The voltaic scholar instructor made sounds that Morrison recognized as his species' expression of profound intellectual satisfaction mixed with existential unease. "Captain, you're suggesting that humanity serves as the compact's strategic deterrent against threats that cannot be managed through conventional diplomatic or military means." Morrison's nod carried the weight of 23 years of military service in which she'd watched human methods prove effective in situations where galactic protocols had failed. "We're the reason that any potential enemy of the compact has to consider whether their threat assessment calculations account for opponents who fight without regard for civilized limitations." The concept was spreading through the observation deck like a revelation, alien minds processing the real reason why human integration had proceeded so successfully despite initial resistance from species who considered humanity primitive and dangerous. It was because humanity was primitive and dangerous, and galactic civilization had learned to appreciate those qualities when properly directed toward external threats. The trial of first blood. The ceremony master's voice carried new understanding as he joined the conversation, was designed to demonstrate species heritage and prepare cadets for service according to established protocols. Morrison watched as the arena floor was restored to its pristine condition, all evidence of Rodriguez's improvised warfare removed by maintenance systems that had probably never encountered solvent-treated glass fragments or cable-wrapped bottles before today. Your human cadet, the ceremony master continued, demonstrated that some species' heritage includes methods that transcend established protocols. Morrison's smile was sharp enough to cut through battleship armor. She demonstrated that when humans are required to fight, we fight to win, whatever that requires. Around the observation deck, alien faculty members were beginning to disperse, their conversations carrying tones that suggested they were rapidly revising curricula, updating threat assessments, and reconsidering the implications of having humans integrated into their military training programs. The Nexari instructor remained, his scales now settled into patterns that Morrison recognized as the complex mixture of respect and wariness that marked how intelligent predators acknowledged the presence of something even more dangerous that happened to be on their side. "Captain," he said quietly, "I have one final question about today's demonstration." Morrison waited, noting how his posture had shifted throughout their conversation from casual authority to something approaching diplomatic caution. When Cadet Rodriguez spoke with her opponents during combat, the instructor continued, his voice carrying undertones that suggested he was asking about something that had implications beyond curiosity. What exactly did she tell them? Morrison's laugh was sharp enough to shatter crystal, carrying the kind of dangerous humor that aliens had learned to associate with human military personnel who'd seen actual combat. She explained human rules of engagement, instructor. The statement hung in the air like a blade held at the perfect angle, elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The Nexari instructor's scales cycled through patterns that suggested his species' databases were processing information that required significant revision of previously held assumptions. "And what," he asked carefully, "are human rules of engagement?" Morrison's smile could have powered a small fleet. "There's only one rule, instructor." She turned toward the observation deck's exit, noting how other faculty members paused their conversations to listen as she delivered the final piece of information that would complete their understanding of humanity's role in galactic civilization. Win. The Academy's medical bay hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced trauma care, monitoring systems creating a technological symphony that spoke of sophisticated medicine applied to the aftermath of primitive violence. Captain Morrison stood beside the treatment alcove where Cadet Thane Corvanis lay connected to regeneration matrices designed to heal wounds that his species' natural armor should have prevented. The Korvaki warrior's compound eyes tracked her movement with an intensity that suggested he was processing information that required significant revision of his worldview. His exoskeleton bore fresh scars where Rodriguez's solvent-treated glass had eaten through materials that could normally withstand direct plasma hits. "Captain," his voice carried undertones Morrison had never heard from his species before, something between respect and the beginning of genuine fear. "I need to understand what happened during the trial." Morrison checked the medical readouts, noting how human combat techniques had created wound patterns that Korvaki physiology had never evolved to handle. The embedded glass fragments had been removed, but the solvent damage would leave permanent scarring that would serve as a constant reminder of today's lessons. "What happened, Cadet, is that you learned something important about human military heritage." Thane's secondary arms moved in patterns that Morrison recognized as his species' expression of profound conceptual distress. "Captain, I have trained in 17 different martial disciplines. I have studied the combat techniques of every species in the compact. I thought I understood warfare." Morrison pulled up a chair beside his treatment alcove, noting how the massive alien's posture suggested someone whose fundamental assumptions about the universe had been forcibly revised. "Tell me what you learned." "The human cadet fought without honor," Thane said slowly, his voice carrying confusion rather than condemnation. "She used deception, improvised weapons, attacked vulnerable points rather than engaging in proper combat. She fought like..." like her life depended on it. Thane's compound eyes refocused on Morrison with an intensity that suggested new understanding. Like survival was more important than demonstration of martial excellence. Morrison nodded, seeing the moment when realization began spreading through alien consciousness. Cadet Corvanus, what do you think human combat training focuses on? The question seemed to catch him off guard. His species approached warfare as an art form, combat as a demonstration of cultural heritage refined through millennia of tradition. The concept of fighting primarily for survival rather than honor was foreign to Korvaki understanding. I assumed, he said carefully, that human combat training would focus on demonstrating your species' martial heritage, the way all civilized species approach warfare. Morrison's laugh was sharp enough to cut steel. Humans don't have martial heritage, Cadet. We have survival methods. The distinction was crucial, and she could see it sinking into his consciousness like a stone dropping into deep water. Around the medical bay, other injured cadets from the trial were receiving treatment for wounds that spoke of their first encounter with human combat techniques. The Altarian battle dancer lay in a nearby alcove, her crystalline anatomy showing stress fractures where Rodriguez had applied leverage in ways that bypassed sophisticated energy defenses. The voltaic scholar warrior was connected to gravitational stabilizers, his internal physics disrupted by combat at ranges where his theoretical advantages became tactical liabilities. Each injury told the same story. Sophisticated opponents had encountered methods that existed outside their understanding of civilized warfare. Captain, Thane's voice carried new undertones that suggested he was beginning to process implications that extended beyond the Academy's training programs. When the human cadet spoke to me during our combat, she explained exactly how she could kill me. Morrison felt her pulse quicken with recognition. She'd delivered similar explanations during her own military career, moments when diplomacy required absolute clarity about the consequences of continued hostility. Not in theoretical future combat, Thane continued, his compound eyes now focused on Morrison with the intensity of someone who'd discovered that the universe contained possibilities he'd never imagined. Right there, with the weapons and position available at that moment. Morrison nodded, understanding the impact such information would have on a species that approached combat as demonstration rather than elimination. What was your reaction? I believed her, Thane said simply, not because of threats or intimidation, but because the explanation was so precise, so detailed, so obviously based on experience rather than theory. The medical bay around them had grown quieter, other injured cadets listening to a conversation that was helping them process their own encounters with human combat methods. Morrison could see understanding spreading through alien minds as they realized that today's trial had introduced them to approaches that transcended their species' understanding of civilized warfare. She spoke like someone who had killed before, Thane continued, his voice now carrying tones that Morrison recognized as the beginning of profound respect mixed with existential unease, not in formal combat or ceremonial trials, but in situations where failure meant death. Morrison felt the familiar tingle that preceded moments when the universe shifted on its axis. She'd experienced it during the Proxima campaign, when human survival techniques had redefined galactic understanding of asymmetric warfare. She'd felt it during the Tau Ceti negotiations, when humanity's reputation for absolute methods had provided diplomatic leverage that conventional military strength couldn't achieve. Cadet, Morrison said quietly, how do you think humans learn to fight? The question hung in the air like a weapon held at the perfect angle, elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Around the medical bay, alien minds processed information that forced them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human nature and capabilities. I don't know, Thane admitted, his voice carrying new humility. My species developed martial arts through millennia of honorable conflict, combat as cultural expression that preserved the dignity of both victor and vanquished. Morrison smiled with the sharp humor that aliens had learned to associate with human military personnel who'd seen actual combat. Humans learned to fight by surviving 50,000 years of competition with everything else on our planet that was trying to kill us. The statement hit the medical bay like a physical impact. Morrison could see its effects rippling through alien consciousness as sophisticated minds processed the implications of a species whose combat techniques had evolved not from cultural expression, but from existential necessity. "We didn't develop martial arts, Cadet. We developed methods for eliminating anything that threatened our survival." Morrison's voice carried the weight of genetic memory, of techniques passed down through countless generations who'd faced the universe with nothing but determination and the refusal to accept extinction. Every human combat technique exists because someone discovered that it was more effective at keeping humans alive than whatever they'd tried before. Thane's compound eyes had gone completely still, the kind of focused attention that marked moments when new information required complete revision of existing worldviews. "Captain, are you saying that human warfare is based entirely on survival rather than cultural expression?" Morrison nodded, noting how other injured cadets had abandoned their own conversations to listen to an explanation that was helping them understand their encounters with Rodriguez's combat methods. "When humans fight, we fight to eliminate threats, permanently, completely, using whatever methods prove most effective." She met Thane's gaze directly, seeing the moment when understanding crystallized into something approaching awe mixed with existential terror. "We don't fight to demonstrate heritage or honor traditions or provide educational experiences. We fight because something is trying to kill us, and we prefer to be the ones still breathing when the violence stops." The medical bay had gone completely silent, except for the hum of regeneration matrices and the barely audible sound of alien respiratory systems processing information that redefined their understanding of human capabilities. The Altarian battle dancer's crystal voice broke the silence, carrying harmonics that suggested consultation with ancestral databases. "Captain Morrison, are you implying that human combat training focuses on lethality rather than artistry?" Morrison felt her smile grow sharper, carrying the kind of dangerous humor that had become humanity's signature in galactic military circles. "I'm not implying anything, Cadet. I'm stating directly that human combat training focuses on keeping humans alive in situations where other methods have failed." She stood, noting how the movement drew attention from every injured alien in the medical bay. They were all processing the same realization. Their encounter with Rodriguez hadn't been an introduction to human martial heritage, but a demonstration of survival techniques refined through millennia of existential conflict. Every human in compact service carries knowledge that was paid for in blood by countless generations who faced the universe with inferior technology, limited resources, and the absolute certainty that failure meant extinction. Morrison's voice carried the weight of 50,000 years of continuous warfare, of techniques developed not in academies, but in situations where theoretical knowledge meant less than practical effectiveness. "We learned to fight from ancestors who survived because they were better at killing threats than anything else was at killing them." The statement hung in the air like a revelation, elegant in its brutal simplicity. Around the medical bay, alien minds processed information that forced them to reconsider not just human capabilities, but the implications of having such capabilities integrated into galactic military structures. "The trial of first blood was designed to demonstrate species heritage," Morrison continued, her voice now carrying tones that suggested she was delivering information that extended beyond academy training protocols. "Rodriguez demonstrated exactly what human heritage looks like when survival is at stake." Thane's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the careful tone of someone who'd discovered that his assumptions about the universe required fundamental revision. "Captain, When human military personnel are deployed in support of compact operations, what exactly are we requesting from your species? Morrison's laugh echoed through the medical bay like a weapon discharge. You're requesting that humans apply 50,000 years of survival techniques to ensure that threats to galactic civilization are eliminated permanently. The implications spread through alien consciousness like shockwaves through stellar medium. Morrison could see understanding dawning in sophisticated minds as they processed the real reason human integration into compact forces had proceeded so successfully despite initial resistance from species who considered humanity primitive. It wasn't because humans brought superior technology or ancient wisdom. It was because humans brought methods that transcended civilized limitations when survival was at stake. Every human in military service represents the accumulated knowledge of a species that learned warfare not as cultural expression, but as existential requirement, Morrison continued, noting how her words affected alien postures and expressions. We're the insurance policy against threats that cannot be managed through conventional diplomatic or military protocols. The voltaic scholar warrior made sounds that Morrison recognized as his species' expression of intellectual satisfaction mixed with existential unease. Captain, you're describing humans as the compact's strategic deterrent against existential threats. Morrison nodded, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came from watching sophisticated minds process information that redefined their understanding of galactic military capabilities. We're the reason that potential enemies of the Compact have to consider whether their threat assessment calculations account for opponents who fight without regard for civilized limitations. Her smile was sharp enough to cut through battleship armor. We're what happens when a species that spent 50,000 years learning to eliminate threats decides that something represents a danger to galactic civilization. The medical bay's silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of advanced technology applied to healing wounds inflicted by primitive methods. Around her, alien cadets processed information that would reshape their understanding of human nature and capabilities. When Morrison left the medical bay, she could hear conversations beginning behind her in dozen languages, alien voices discussing implications that would ripple through galactic military doctrine for generations to come. The Academy's corridors hummed with unusual energy as she made her way back to her quarters. Groups of cadets from different species clustered in configurations that hadn't existed before the trial, their conversations carrying tones that suggested rapid revision of previously held assumptions. Near the dormitory sections, she found Rodriguez surrounded by a mixed group of alien cadets asking questions in rapid, excited voices. The human was demonstrating grip techniques using improvised materials, her hands moving as she explained concepts that had no names in galactic languages. The key, Rodriguez was saying to a fascinated Zephyrian engineer, is understanding that everything is a potential weapon if you're creative enough about application. Morrison paused to listen, noting how the alien cadets hung on every word, despite the fact that Rodriguez was describing methods that violated every protocol for civilized interaction between species. Humans don't fight fair, Rodriguez continued, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious concepts to children, because fair fighting is a luxury that dead people can't afford. The statement drew sounds of appreciation from several Korvaki warrior cadets, their species' respect for effective violence overriding their usual contempt for weaker beings. The Altarians whispered among themselves in crystalline harmonics that suggested database consultation and rapid information processing. Morrison smiled with satisfaction as she continued toward her quarters. The Academy's integration protocols were working exactly as designed, though probably not in ways that the original planners had anticipated. Human cadets weren't learning to fight like galactic citizens. Galactic citizens were learning to fight alongside humans, and discovering that the combination created military capabilities that transcended anything either approach could achieve independently. The result was exactly what the compact needed: military units that could engage in traditional galactic warfare when circumstances required diplomatic solutions, and could shift to human-style total warfare when circumstances required the complete elimination of threats. As Morrison reached her quarters, she could still hear Rodriguez's voice echoing through the corridors, explaining to fascinated aliens exactly what human military heritage looked like when survival was at stake. The sound carried the promise of a galactic military that would never again need to worry about threats that couldn't be managed through civilized protocols, because now they had humans, and humans didn't lose.